Hello, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us for today's discussion hosted by Environmental Defence. My name is Gina. I'm a senior reporter at Responsible Investor, and I'm delighted to be chatting today with Julie Segal about some really interesting research she's done about sustainable finance policies. Julie, if you don't know her, is currently Senior Manager Climate Finance at Environmental Defence, where she works to advance climate-related financial policy and regulation. She is also a Just Transition Visiting Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And her research, which is the focus of our discussion today, sought to explore a number of key questions. In particular, Julie analysed four jurisdictions: Canada, Australia, the UK, and the EU, and investigated to what extent each have implemented a series of climate-related financial policies across their financial systems, and to what extent these policies have been planned in tandem with general climate commitments. As part of this, Julie has also aimed to answer the question, is Canada lagging behind its peers? So let's get on with the conversation. And I guess, Julie, my first question would be, why now? What brought on this research?
Thanks, Gina, for the great introduction, and thanks everyone for joining for the conversation. So as you highlighted, the research ties a couple of different things together. One of the hypotheses that prompted this research is that Canada lags behind other peer countries when it comes to implementing sustainable finance. That policy or that hypothesis isn't something that I designed for this research, but rather something that inspired the research because a number of experts had been saying that Canada was lagging behind for years. And when I say experts, I'm referring to research by the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing, calling Canada a low regulation jurisdiction on sustainable finance policy. This is coming from Mark Carney before he became Prime Minister, testifying, saying that Canada is an international laggard on sustainable finance policy. All of these claims have been asserted and proposed in ways that felt right to a number of Canadian sustainable finance policy experts, but it had not been empirically proven. So there was this claim going out there, a common refrain, that we were behind on sustainable finance policy. And that's one of the reasons that we need to act so quickly to fix it in Canada. But it hadn't been empirically proven. And that was one of the main things this research wanted to see, compared to peers and looking at the core sustainable finance policies. How are countries positioned against each other? Another reason why this research came about now is because there have been so many commitments from so many different from among key jurisdictions about sustainable finance policy. Most of the countries studied in this report, which we'll get into, is Canada, European Union, United Kingdom, and Australia, legislated climate commitments about 4 to 6 years ago. So that's a government cycle, a significant amount of time for countries to deliver policy, and a lot has been delivered on climate policy and on sustainable finance policy across G7 countries, across these particular jurisdictions that are studied too. A lot on climate policy has started to wane or be pulled back in general, not just related to a sustainable financial system. One piece that has not necessarily been a key focus yet of the climate legislation that all of these countries put forward is that they all talk about sustainable finance policy as part of how they're going to prepare the economy for climate change or meet their climate goals. And there hasn't been the same level of accountability on that as there is, for example, on a top line climate target. So this research also gets into that, saying, okay, these jurisdictions said they would set rules over finance as it relates to climate change. Have they done that? And have they done that in the way that their legislation and climate plans promised and intended they would?
Mm-hmm. No, thanks for that. And I will get to the actual results themselves, as that's the good stuff. But just beforehand, obviously, yeah, you did compare these 4 jurisdictions regarding sort of 10 different policies, which ranges from, disclosure requirements, transition plans, greenwashing rules, taxonomy. So just, yeah, very quickly, how did you and why did you select those jurisdictions and kind of come up with that list of policies?
Thanks, Gina. So as you mentioned, the research studies 10 core policies, but 2 of them are used as the selection barometer. So 2 of the policies actually answer the question about why the countries. One of the key foundations was that all of the jurisdictions in the study had to have legislated a climate target. That's best practice, recognized by research, policy experts, that legislating that you're going to reach net zero by 2050 is best practice. That holds you accountable to your citizens. It gives you an opportunity to design all of your policy in a cohesive direction. So that was point 1. And then point 2 is that you have sustainable finance as part of that, that your rules related to the financial sector are intended to be modernized to align with and interact with your climate commitment. I started by looking at G7 countries for comparison. The US does not have a legislated climate commitment, so they didn't meet that parameter in terms of having a common baseline for the research. And then Japan was an interesting case, another G7 country, which wasn't included in the research because Japan has a number of sustainable finance policies, but hadn't included sustainable finance policy within their climate commitment in the same way that UK, Europe, and Canada have. So again, that comparability for the research wasn't there, even though Japan has a number of sustainable finance policies, and I imagine would score pretty well on the grid of other important policies. And then Australia was added because they've made so much progress on sustainable finance. They're in many other indicators a comparable jurisdiction to the one studied here. And it was also important to have not just Canada, UK, EU as the 3 jurisdictions, and then to say, well, Canada's behind because, again, anecdotally, UK and EU are recognized as being some of the leaders on sustainable finance policy in terms of starting early and moving quickly. So Australia, as an economy more similar to Canada and a political environment more similar to Canada, was added as a 4th comparable. Now, in terms of the policies, this area I found really exciting to identify the core sustainable finance policies because that could be a separate research piece in and of itself to highlight, and it is in a way. So I'd say this is an initial contribution to saying what are the common sustainable finance policies. I looked at non-academic literature, but looking at things like the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, the Principles of Responsible Investment, the Network for Grading the Financial System, as well as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to see what are the most common typical sustainable finance policies that are recommended. And that's how I came up with a list of, and that's how the research used a list of 8. As I said, that can be a research piece in and of itself to say what are the most common, useful, implemented sustainable finance policies. This is a starting proposition, and it includes things from reporting to on risk to transition plans to vulnerability assessments, greenwashing rules, and maybe we can dig into the full gamut.
No, amazing. Yeah, I think it's very helpful for people to understand kind of, okay, what was the process here? And I guess for any of the listeners who want to take this further, I do agree you could do a whole project on that alone. So yes, but getting into the results themselves, it's a mixed bag, I think is fair to say. For you, what are those big takeaways that you want to highlight? Where maybe are those policy areas where there's kind of consistent progress across jurisdictions, but maybe where is there more divergence? And also, yeah, what are kind of some of the gaps that are present across all of the jurisdictions? Obviously, we'll go specifically on Canada in a bit, but yeah, just kind of overall.
Sure. Overall, you asked about some of the areas of similarities and differences. So there's 2 pieces that I'll highlight for the results. First, the degree to which a jurisdiction committed to sustainable finance policy is immaterial to what they've implemented, to a surprising degree. So, for example, the United Kingdom committed to, in their climate plan, almost all 8 of the sustainable finance policies. And they've implemented about 5. And so that's still a pretty good score, but it's just not the same. And similarly, inversely, I should say, for the European Union, they committed to about 5 of the policies, and they've implemented nearly all 8. And then Canada and Australia, likewise, they didn't necessarily implement not just the same number of policies, but sometimes not even the same type that they committed to. So that piece was quite interesting to see that what a country committed to on sustainable finance is immaterial from what they did. The second core result was that some policies have been implemented almost across the board and have become a foundation globally, with the glaring exception of Canada among the studied jurisdictions. Canada was the only outlier to not have mandated clarified supervisor mandates related to sustainable finance to say you should be taking into consider climate change as a financial regulator or supervisor. All of the other jurisdictions had that as a foundation. That makes a lot of sense to be saying that a regulator has to deal with this new problem. It's not prescriptive, but it is saying you have to take climate change into consideration in your duty, and that you have permission from the government to take consideration of climate change into your duty. So that's a really interesting foundation. The second one is risk disclosures. Again, all of the jurisdictions except for Canada have climate risk disclosures across the economy for the financial sector and real economy corporations. And that also makes sense as a foundation, which isn't enough for a climate resilient or aligned financial system. However, is an important foundation to just have some information out there. So those are foundations that exist. As well, all of the jurisdictions, including Canada, have some type of scenario analysis or vulnerability assessment, either required in reporting or from the central bank itself to do that work. And then at the time of writing, one thing has changed here, but when it comes to greenwashing, at the time of writing, all of the jurisdictions had some type of greenwashing legislation. And for those who are really interested in the comparison, I found on greenwashing it was really interesting because the UK and EU had gone ahead with more labeling style regulations, where fund naming or labeling had strict rules, direct rules related to greenwashing. Whereas in Australia and Canada, there were more general deceptive claim regulations that were leveled up for greenwashing. So it was different approaches for greenwashing and scenario analysis, but those were across the board inclusive of Canada. I guess that's the second interesting result then, is how the particular policies either exist as a foundation where they don't exist in Canada uniquely, and then where they are kind of being carried forward in different but similar ways.
Yeah, we'll get on to obviously the changes with the greenwashing rules in a little bit. But yeah, I mean, obviously kind of already gotten into what I was going to ask next. Yeah, honing specifically on Canada. As you said, part of the research was kind of to test this idea, this hypothesis that it lags behind its peers. And obviously suggested by what you were just saying then, but also the research says it. The answer is yes. Not only has it implemented fewer policies than others, but it's also been more fragmented in its implementation of these policies. So yeah, I mean, could you just dig into this a little bit more? Kind of where are those key gaps that you haven't already mentioned, and those really the areas of fragmentation?
Thanks, Gina. I can focus on that in terms of the areas of fragmentation for Canada, because as you said, I got into a bit how Canada is a unique outlier in some of these, which surprised even against the hypothesis.
Actually, yeah, sorry, that is a good quick extra bit, were you surprised by these results? Like, obviously there is this hypothesis that has been out there, but did you expect it to be as it is? Sorry, yeah.
You know what? I was quite shocked by how behind Canada is. In the research, which is open access and available online, as well as summarized in a commentary on the London School of Economics, GRI, Grantham Research Institute. So you can see the table which compares the four jurisdictions across the 10 policies, and Canada is strikingly behind. So, as I said, politicians, global research groups have said Canada's a laggard. It was jarring to me just how far behind we were, as well as the fact that Canada is unique in some foundational areas of not having that policy where every other one does. It's not even a mixed bag across jurisdictions moving forward on across the areas. There were some that were, clear lines of green, yes, implemented, except for Canada. So that was surprising and concerning. Overall, the results were that the EU had implemented nearly all 8 of the policies, the UK and Australia about 5 or 6, and Canada less than 3. And part of those partial scores are for different parts of the financial system. That gets to the question of fragmentation. The paper looked at how cohesively sustainable finance policy had been applied when it was. And not only did Canada lag by number, but there was less cohesion, more fragmentation within it. I'll give 2 examples here. One is in the net zero plan of the country, Canada mentioned sustainable finance related to net zero plans for the financial sector. So that was written about 4 years ago in common parlance, transition plans. There's been almost no progress on regulating transition plans in Canada, even though that was one of the foundational areas that the government had committed to in its climate plan. So that's one area of fragmentation between intent and implementation. There is, as many people will be aware, some mention of transition plans for banking and insurance from the federal financial regulator, OSFI. However, those are kind of TBD when and TBD what. So in general practice, they're understood as not being implemented, the transition plan requirements. Which brings to the second point of fragmentation, which is across different parts of the financial system. And that was also quite jarring in terms of a gap and higher fragmentation for Canada. For example, banks, insurance companies, federally regulated financial institutions are required under OSFI Guideline V15 to report on climate risk disclosures. But no companies in Canada are required to report climate risk disclosures. That's not an ideal situation for information flow, and not even talking about, a climate aligned financial system or moving money, just information, it creates a headache. So that mismatch between the different parts of the financial sector and the corporate disclosure requirements is very significant in Canada. If you look at the other jurisdictions in the study, there's a lot more cohesion. Australia, for example, has one piece of legislation that applies to almost all types of financial institutions across the economy. The EU has a number of pieces of legislation which are being worked through in terms of new policies to think about how to align it. The UK also has different types of policies, particularly in the mandates for its supervisors, which were done in a batch to make them slightly more organized and cohesive. So Canada has that fragmentation between the different parts of the financial system on the sustainable finance policy that it does have, which doesn't set up the financial sector to implement sustainable finance policy smoothly. Not just are there gaps, but it's not consistent throughout.
So I guess then the natural next question would be, the why. Obviously that wasn't necessarily a focus. But from your perspective, given obviously your expertise and experience in the space, yeah, why do you think that Canada does lag? Maybe what's not gone quite to plan?
As you said, that's not what the research focused on. The one piece the research can say is that it's not because of a lack of intention. Canada wasn't a material outlier in terms of the intention to have sustainable finance policy. It is a material outlier in terms of lagging on implementing it. There's a number of these theories for this. In the sense of Canada has a fragmented financial system in terms of regulation provincially for parts of it and federally for parts of it. That should be surmountable. There's a number of theories in terms of potentially, a hesitancy to move in a direction different from the United States on financial regulation, which should not be particularly material as Canada's looking for growing trade partners with all of these other jurisdictions in the study, particularly UK and Australia, UK and the EU, which are more advanced than Canada on sustainable finance policy. There are other theories in terms of a high oil and gas economy holding back the country from climate-related policies in general, playing into the laggard position on sustainable finance policy. So as we were talking about in terms of the policy identification, this is an entirely additional research project in terms of why, but it's a very valid question because it needs to be fixed. And Canada keeps taking, even in terms of the promises or I shouldn't say promises, I should say the government stated commitments, which have been made publicly multiple times to move forward on different pieces of sustainable finance policy. There's been kind of two steps, one step forward, one step back, probably most accurately. And the question of why there's so much distance between us and the peers is relevant, as well as getting to it and fixing it.
Yeah, and that's another one to the list of research people can take up on. But yeah, on government steps, government commitments, this research was completed recently, but since the government, did put out its budget, which included its climate competitive strategy. And as part of that, we did see some updates regarding the greenwashing rules, the taxonomy and climate disclosures, from, what they said in it. What are your thoughts on its impact, now where Canada places compared to peers?
Thanks, Gina. It's great to have this question about just a couple of weeks ago, things have changed in Canada. So how are we updating the research conversation to where we are at now? Because all of, any academic research has a very long gestation period between writing. So it's great to make sure it's up to date. And there are some changes for Canada that are needing to be mentioned here. So when I had said that Canada had about 2.5 policies implemented, that was scenario analysis, greenwashing, and then the ESG risk disclosures for federally regulated financial institutions. However, in the most recent 2025 federal budget, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government proposed repealing the greenwashing laws. That is still in process, although the budget did give quite a bit of detail on a full repeal as an intention. So that is still in process, but that was a pretty clear indication that greenwashing would be removed. And that was something celebrated by about 97% of Canadians, is the most recent polling I saw, which of Canadians who found that important for various reasons, including for the financial system. So I'll note that if moved through, would update the research so that on both on mandates, greenwashing, and risk disclosure, there would now be 3 areas where Canada is the unique outlier to not have those policies relative to those newly important trade partners. The other updates, the government re-announced a taxonomy. I don't think this yet changes the research, as this is the 4th time the government has re-announced a taxonomy for sustainable finance. And then there were no material changes on climate risk disclosure. There had been under last year's miniature budget a commitment to advance climate-related disclosures for federally regulated companies. This year's budget seems to walk that back a bit, saying, you know what, we're not actually making any promises. So it still doesn't exist.
No, amazing, thank you. And I guess, given all of what you found, but also just, your experience and your expertise, looking ahead from your perspective, kind of what should be urgent areas, maybe not just area of focus, sort of, for the Canadian government to kind of, catch up, shall we say, but also, more broadly across the other jurisdictions. Is there something everyone could be doing more of?
Great, Gina. One conclusion from this research is that having these policies implemented cohesively makes sense, right? If you look at Canada, there were greenwashing regulations without disclosure requirements, which means that companies could just voluntarily stop publishing materials because they weren't required to, and they were now scared of being being critiqued for greenwashing if they were. So having that fragmentation and asymmetry isn't in the best interest of advancing on sustainable finance policy. Advancing with cohesion across all of these core policies is what makes sense. So that's one of the conclusions of this research. Absolutely. In terms of core policies, net zero transition plans, climate transition plans for all parts of the financial system should be a priority. The UK government recently decided not to move forward with a taxonomy in their announcement, highlighting it's because they're prioritizing climate transition plans. Australia has had that as part of their roadmap from the beginning as well. And it's an area that, as I mentioned, Canada had committed to in its initial net zero plan under legislation. So those are the two key takeaways. Practically, climate-related transition plans are a very important missing piece, which has enormous support from investors and climate experts alike. And while focusing on that important point, make sure that it's part of a system of sustainable finance policies that integrate together and work cohesively across all parts of the financial system in your climate plan.
No, thank you. And sadly, I think that's all we have time for. Although, I cannot recommend enough for people to check out the research itself. As I particularly the table is very helpful visualizing all of this. I just want to say thanks again, Julie, for taking the time to chat to me all about it. And for those who are interested in reading it more in full, it can be found, as you said, in the Canadian Public Policy Journal. So that's all from me. Once again, thank you, Julie, but also thank you for Environmental Defence for hosting this discussion.
Thanks so much, Gina, for joining us for this discussion and for your questions and helping us tease out the research for everyone listening.
No, always happy to chat.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.